Okay, so what we're going to go through with you today is America's road to war in World War One. As we talked about earlier in this unit, Europe had been fighting for roughly about 3 years before America starts to get involved. And so what you see here on the very first page is Uncle Sam and one of his more famous images, which is the "I Want You" poster for the American Army. And it's interesting because the way it's drawn, it doesn't matter where you go in the room, he's looking at you. And this was a very effective propaganda tool to get American men to enlist in the military. And what we're going to do today is kind of talk about why we got involved in the war. The first thing to understand is that America claimed itself to be neutral early on in the war, and neutral means you don't take sides. If you are a neutral country, you don't help anybody, you just stay to yourself. And a lot of Americans agreed with this. They're reading about this war in the newspapers where millions of people are dying, the trenches are dirty, and it was all because the Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. And frankly, most Americans, they don't care about that. They just want to worry about themselves. However, you do have a large contingent of immigrants from other countries, specifically in Europe, who do feel strongly about the war. And so some of them will go back to their home countries and fight. Others will ask America to get involved to help their country. But for the most part, they want to remain neutral. The second bullet there, banks still lend money to European nations and we still trade with nations. War's a pretty good moneymaker. And so if a country called us and asked for money for a loan, we would give it to them because they're going to have to pay us back plus interest, and that's going to make them money. And so what ends up happening, though, is the British, they enforce what's known as a blockade. That's when the Navy, in essence, surrounds a country and doesn't let anything in or out. And so what that does is we begin to trade with Britain. And you can see there they buy $75 million of war goods from the United States. So if you look at this here, these green lines here are the blockade. Well, there's Germany. So there is no way that the Americans can even get their boats into Germany if we wanted to trade with them. And so what ends up happening is we end up trading almost solely with Great Britain. Problem with that is we claim to be neutral. So if you're neutral, you're not supposed to help anybody. When you're providing Great Britain with weapons and $75 million of war goods, the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians, the Ottoman Empire, they're not going to like that. And that's going to be one of the reasons that we get involved in the war. So our initial views, again, it's Europe's problem. We need to stay out of it. Our president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, he actually got reelected on the basis that it was Europe's problem and he was going to keep us out of Europe's war. You can see a pin there from his reelection campaign: War in Europe, Peace in America, God bless Wilson. And so he ran on the idea that we weren't going to go and fight in Europe, but something is going to change that. So one of the first things that happens is the Russian Revolution. So Russia was fighting on the side of the Allies. And if you remember the map, Germany's in the middle, France is to the west, and Russia's to the east. What happens, though, is Russia, they're fighting, and their citizens don't necessarily want to be involved in this war. And so they have a revolution starts in their country where a group of people led by Vladimir Lenin, known as the Bolsheviks, fight back against the monarchy and the Tsar, and they overthrow him. And so I'm going to go back just so you can see. So if you look at this map, Russia's here, France is here. And so Germany and Austria-Hungary, they had to worry about the Russians attacking them from their east. Well, I always ask the question, how can you fight somebody else and yourself at the same time? And the answer is you can't. So once Russia starts fighting itself, that enables Germany and Austria-Hungary to take all of their soldiers here and focus them on the French. So that's going to put a lot more pressure on the French, the British, and they're going to start, kind of pressuring us. We need help. We need help. But the main thing that came out of this is that Russia was the only monarchy on the Allied side. For the other Allied countries all had democracies. One thing America loves to fight for and to bring to other people is democracy. So once the Russians are out, America can then justify fighting as a way of fighting to promote democracy. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire are all ruled by monarchs, right? So in our eyes, if we can defeat them, we could bring democracy to Europe. So that's one of the reasons that we get involved. The second one is known as the Zimmermann telegram. And so this was something that the British claimed that they have intercepted from the Germans. And apparently, what it was a letter from Germany to Mexico. And it was essentially asking, the Germans were asking Mexico to attack the United States. And if they attacked the United States and were successful, they would get the area back that they had lost in the Mexican American War, which was Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of California. Um, it really wasn't taken seriously by the government, but for the American public, they were cautious. Why would the Germans want Mexico to attack us? We did nothing with Mexico. And so it was viewed as British propaganda. People viewed it as something the British made up to encourage us to fight. And so but in the end, Americans look at that and they're like, if the Germans are trying to get our friends to attack us, maybe we need to do something about that. The next one is what you call unrestricted submarine warfare by Germany. So the German submarines are known as U-boats. Mr. Smith has some German linguistics, so he'd be able to tell you exactly how to pronounce it. But what happens is German submarines, they patrol the entire Atlantic Ocean, right? And so when we're sending goods to Britain, the Germans start blowing up our boats. And so we're neutral. We're not allowed to attack back. If we attack back, we are no longer neutral and we are fighting the Germans, right? And so really what President Wilson does is he asks the Germans to stop sinking our boats. And what they ask is we need to stop giving Britain money and weapons because those money and weapons are being used to kill Germans. Wilson says we're not going to do that. And so the Germans continue to blow up our boats. Completely justified by the Germans. But again, the American government, the newspapers, they're going to make it seem like the Germans are just evil people and they're killing innocent Americans. Technically, are they innocent? Sure. They weren't fighting in the war. But in the Germans' eyes, they're helping their enemy, and so they have the right to attack them. And one of the big events here, and you need to know this one, is the Lusitania. That was a German U-boat that sunk it was a passenger ship. It was essentially like a cruise ship. It went from, I believe it was Long Island, and it was going to Ireland. And so what America started doing is we started to hide weapons and money and supplies in the bottom of passenger ships. We believe that if we put them in the passenger ships, the Germans wouldn't attack them. If we send it on a Navy boat, they're going to attack it. But if you put it on a passenger ship, the Germans won't attack it. The Germans actually knew that we were doing this. They actually took out ads in American newspapers and told Americans not to get on the boat because if they found it, they were going to blow it up. And they did exactly that on May 7th, 1915, and 128 Americans die in that. And so you can see in this image, right here is where the two torpedoes hit. This is from a newspaper, the New York Times. It was sunk. They're guessing that 1,260 people died. It sinks in 15 minutes, which is really quick. There's really not a lot of time to get to the lifeboats. And then they bring up a couple names, Vanderbilt, Froman. Froman's a big meatpacking family. Vanderbilt is, if you've ever heard of the college, right? So they bring up these names of prominent Americans who were killed. And then it says, Washington believes that a grave crisis is at hand, right? Here's the beginning of the war. What they don't tell Americans is that there were weapons on the bottom of that boat. And they just make it seem like the Germans attacked a passenger ship with innocent civilians on it. So what ends up happening is a couple years later, the Germans continue to sink our ships. And so we inevitably declare war. You can only attack our boats for so long before we decide to attack back. And so on April 6, 1917, the U.S. government votes unanimously for war. And so what has to happen now is we have to get soldiers ready to fight. And so the American Expeditionary Force was the first group of soldiers that were sent over there. They were our army, and they went over there pretty quickly. However, For the rest of the American military, it took a long time to get them into fighting shape. We drafted men, and so the military wasn't ready to go. There were people that were drafted into the war that were staying in hotels. The military bases didn't have enough housing for them. And one thing that came out of this that we still see today is um, PE class, gym class. Woodrow Wilson made gym class mandatory for all American public schools um, after World War One. It took us so long. It took about 6 months for us to get most of the men who were fighting in fighting shape. That the decision was made that we have to have our kids ready to go to war. And that was one of the reasons that we have gym class today. It's supposed to keep you in shape and ready to go. But what you see there is that when the Russians leave, we can begin to fight for democracy. The Zimmerman telegram, those two things, they're kind of underlying reasons. They're not enough to go to war. But then the spark, what really sends us into war, is that the Germans attack our boats. The German submarines, they just continuously attack us, and so that inevitably leads us into World War One. So that's how we got involved, and you'll see we get involved in 1917. The war will end in November of 1918. So we're there for roughly a year and a half before the war ends. But we'll talk more about America's involvement with a later class.